February 14, 1982, 7 p.m. Grand Banks, North Atlantic Ocean, 166 miles east of St. John's Sayres, Newfoundland. Kent Thompson, 32 years old, senior tool pusher on the Ocean Ranger drilling rig, stood in the galley drinking coffee and watching through the window as waves the size of buildings rolled toward the platform. He'd worked offshore oil rigs for 12 years, survived Gulf of Mexico hurricanes, North Sea storms, and the brutal winter weather of the Grand Banks. This storm was different, bigger, meaner, but the Ocean Ranger was the world's largest semi-submersible drilling platform, 396 feet long, 337 feet high, 25,000 tons of steel, designed to withstand 100-knot winds and 110-foot waves. "She'll ride it out," Kent said to his crewmate, electrician Bob Whelan, 28. "She always does." What Kent Thompson didn't know, what none of the 84 men aboard the Ocean Ranger knew, was that within 8 hours every single one of them would be dead, victims not of the storm's power, but of a catastrophic design flaw. A single porthole window in the ballast control room positioned just 25 feet above the waterline, protected by glass that could shatter, flooding the room that controlled the rig's stability with seawater that would short-circuit the electrical systems and leave the crew unable to prevent the platform from capsizing into the freezing Atlantic. The irony was crushing. The Ocean Ranger was considered unsinkable by its designers, its operators and its crew. Built in 1976 by Ocean Drilling and Exploration Company ODECO in Hiroshima, Japan, it was the largest semi-submersible oil rig ever constructed. The platform floated on 2 massive pontoons, 400 feet long, lying 80 feet below the waterline, that contained ballast tanks capable of being filled or emptied to adjust the rig's stability. The system was sophisticated, computer-controlled, automated. It had successfully operated through countless storms since arriving at the Grand Banks in 1980. The rig was chartered by Mobil Oil Canada to drill the Hibernia oil field, one of the richest petroleum discoveries in Canadian history. The drilling operation was enormously profitable. Oil prices in 1982 were high, and the Hibernia field promised decades of production. Mobil was paying ODECO approximately $65,000 per day to lease the Ocean Ranger. That translated to enormous pressure to maintain operations, to keep drilling, to avoid shutdowns that would cost hundreds of thousands in lost revenue. The Grand Banks were notorious for brutal winter weather. The region where the cold Labrador Current meets the warm Gulf Stream creates atmospheric instability that spawns powerful storms. February was the worst month. Temperatures routinely dropped below freezing, winds exceeded 70 knots, and waves could reach 80 feet. But the Ocean Ranger had weathered 2 winters on the Grand Banks without serious incident. The crew had confidence in the platform, and that confidence bred complacency. On February 14, weather forecasts predicted a severe storm approaching, a major Atlantic cyclone generating winds potentially exceeding 80 knots and waves that could reach 100 feet or higher. This was extreme, but not unprecedented for the Grand Banks in winter. The Ocean Ranger's operations manager, Captain Clarence House, received the forecast at 6 a.m. and made a decision: continue drilling. The rig was designed for exactly these conditions. Shutting down would cost Mobil money, and might suggest weakness or overcaution. Standard storm preparation procedures were implemented. Loose equipment was secured, weather-tight doors sealed, drilling operations slowed but not stopped. The ballast control system, critical for maintaining stability, was checked and found functioning normally. Everything was routine. The crew had done this dozens of times before. Among the 84 men aboard were drillers, roughnecks, engineers, electricians, cooks, medics, a complete offshore community working 12-hour shifts in rotating crews. Many were Newfoundlanders, locals for whom offshore oil work provided rare high-paying employment in a region with limited economic opportunities. Others were Americans, Canadians from other provinces, even a few Europeans. The youngest was 19 years old, the oldest was 56, average age was 31. Bob Whelan, the electrician from Nova Scotia, had been on the Ocean Ranger for 6 months. He was engaged to be married in April, had bought a house in Halifax, was saving money for the wedding. He'd told his fiancée Lisa on their last phone call 3 days earlier, 2 more weeks then I'm home for good. I've had enough of this offshore life. Had a wife and 2 children in Texas. He'd worked offshore his entire adult life, moving from rig to rig as contracts expired and new opportunities emerged. The Ocean Ranger was his ninth platform. He was experienced, competent, and utterly confident in the rig's capabilities. What neither man knew, what none of the crew knew, was that the Ocean Ranger had a fatal design flaw. The ballast control room, housing all the electronic equipment and control panels that regulated the platform's stability, was located in the rig's lower sections, just 25 feet above the waterline. This room had portholes, circular windows that allowed ventilation and natural light. The portholes were sealed with standard marine glass, not reinforced or laminated glass, not the heavy-duty glass used in critical areas of ships and offshore platforms. The designers had calculated maximum wave heights, determined that 25 feet above the waterline was safe, and installed standard portholes. They hadn't accounted for rogue waves, anomalous waves that can be 2 or 3 times higher than surrounding waves, created by constructive interference of multiple wave trains. Rogue waves were poorly understood in 1976 when the Ocean Ranger was designed. They were considered rare, unlikely, not worth designing against. As the storm intensified through the afternoon and evening of February 14, conditions rapidly exceeded normal storm parameters. By 7 p.m., winds were gusting to 90 knots, well beyond the 100-knot design limit. Waves were regularly reaching 80 feet, with larger sets approaching 100 feet. The Ocean Ranger was experiencing the most severe weather since it had arrived at the Grand Banks. At 7 p.m., a rogue wave struck the ODECO 706, another drilling platform operated by Mobil located approximately 50 miles from the Ocean Ranger. The wave, estimated at 109–110 feet high, swept across the ODECO's deck, destroying equipment and washing away a lifeboat. The ODECO radioed the Ocean Ranger reporting the damage and warning of extreme wave heights. Captain House received the report and made another decision: continue operations but suspend drilling and prepare for possible evacuation if conditions worsened. This was a calculated risk. Evacuating the platform meant shutting down completely, potentially for days. Helicopters couldn't fly in these conditions, so evacuation would require lifeboats, a dangerous operation in heavy seas. Better to ride out the storm on the platform unless absolutely necessary to abandon. By 10 p.m., waves were consistently exceeding 80 feet, with individual sets reaching 100 feet. The Ocean Ranger was handling the conditions, rolling and pitching significantly but within acceptable parameters. The ballast control system automatically adjusted tank levels to maintain stability, compensating for the rig's movements. Everything was functioning as designed. In the ballast control room, operators Randy Crocker and Dave Blackmore monitored the automated systems. The room was cramped, filled with control panels, switches, indicators, and computer displays showing ballast tank levels, pump status, and stability parameters. The system was complex, regulating ballast in multiple tanks across the 2 massive pontoons, adjusting constantly as waves and wind affected the rig. At 11:52 p.m., a rogue wave struck the Ocean Ranger. The wave, later estimated at 120–130 feet high, significantly beyond the rig's design limits, rose out of the storm with little warning, a wall of water climbing toward the platform. The wave struck with tremendous force, completely submerging portions of the lower structure that were normally well above the waterline. The wave shattered the porthole in the ballast control room. The porthole glass, designed for normal marine conditions, not for the impact of a 120-foot wave traveling at 40–50 knots, exploded inward, sending glass fragments across the room. Seawater poured through the opening, a circular hole approximately 18 inches in diameter, positioned directly in the path of subsequent waves. Randy Crocker was standing near the porthole when it shattered. Glass fragments lacerated his face and hands. He staggered backward, temporarily blinded by blood and salt water, unable to see the extent of damage. Dave Blackmore grabbed the radio control room to bridge. "We've got flooding in ballast control. Portholes blown out." Captain House responded immediately, "Can you seal it? We're trying. Water's coming in with every wave." The crew attempted to stuff the opening with blankets, mattresses, anything that might slow the flooding, but every wave sent more water through the porthole, not just spray but solid volumes of seawater under tremendous pressure. Within minutes, the room was ankle deep in water, and the water was rising. The ballast control system consisted of electronic components, circuit boards, switches and relays, all vulnerable to salt water. As seawater contacted electrical systems, short circuits began occurring, indicator lights flickered and died. Control switches stopped responding. Pumps activated randomly, valves opened and closed without commands. At 12:15 a.m., the automated ballast control system failed completely. Electrical shorts had destroyed critical components. Electrical shorts had destroyed critical components. The sophisticated computer system that had maintained the Ocean Ranger's stability through countless storms was now completely non-functional. The operators attempted to switch to manual control, but manual control required training that most crew members hadn't received. The Ocean Ranger's ballast system was designed to be automatic. Manual override was intended only for maintenance or emergency situations, and the training for manual operation was minimal. More critically, the manual control procedures weren't documented in any accessible manual or procedure book. The operators had to figure out how to manually control a complex system while water flooded the control room and the platform rolled in massive seas. At 12:30 a.m., the crew on the bridge noticed the rig developing a list, tilting forward toward the bow. The list was slight initially, perhaps 2-3 degrees, barely noticeable, but it was increasing. And any list was dangerous because it meant the ballast system wasn't compensating properly. Captain Hulse immediately recognized the severity. A list on a semi-submersible platform in heavy seas could create a feedback loop. The list causes the bow to ride lower into waves. Waves force more water into forward compartments. Additional water increases the list, and the cycle accelerates until the platform capsizes. Get that ballast system back online, Hulse ordered. We need to correct this list immediately. In the ballast control room, Randy Crocker and Dave Blackmore were desperately trying to operate the manual controls, but the system wasn't responding predictably. They'd close valves in forward tanks trying to prevent more water from entering, but the valves wouldn't close, or would close and then reopen minutes later without command. They'd activate pumps to remove water from forward tanks, but pumps would shut off randomly or activate in the wrong tanks. What they didn't know, what would only become clear in the investigation afterward, was that the electrical shorts had damaged not just the automated control system, but also the manual control circuits. When they thought they were manually controlling valves and pumps, they were actually sending signals through partially shorted circuits that were executing commands inconsistently or not at all. By 1 a.m., the list had increased to 5-7 degrees. This was severe enough that walking on deck required holding railings. Equipment not properly secured began sliding. Most critically, the forward chain lockers, compartments in the platform support columns where anchor chains were stored, were flooding. These compartments weren't watertight, and weren't designed to be because normally they were well above the waterline. But with the list putting the bow lower, waves were reaching the chain locker openings and flooding them. At 1:15 a.m., Kent Thompson, who'd been in the galley when the porthole shattered, arrived at the ballast control room to help. He found chaos, ankle-deep water, flickering lights, control panels sparking, and 2 operators desperately manipulating switches and valves that weren't responding correctly. "What do you need?" Kent asked. "We need to pump water out of the forward tanks," Dave Blackmore said. "But the pumps aren't working right. We start them, they run for a minute, then shut off. Or they pump for a while, then reverse and start pumping water back in." Kent examined the control panels. He was a driller, not an electrician or ballast control specialist. He knew the basics but not the intricacies of the system. "Are we on manual or automatic?" "Manual. Automatic's completely fried." "Then why are pumps activating on their own?" "We don't know. System's all fucked up." This was the critical moment. The Ocean Ranger's fate was being decided in a flooded control room by 3 men trying to operate a malfunctioning system they didn't fully understand, without documentation, while the platform listed further with every passing minute. The ballast control system's design had a fatal flaw beyond just the vulnerable porthole. The ballast pumps, critical for removing water from tanks and correcting list, were located in the aft rear pontoons. As the platform developed a forward list, the bow sank lower, and the stern rose higher. This created a problem: water flows downhill. To pump water out of forward tanks, the pumps had to push water upward from the forward tanks, through piping, all the way to the stern where it could be discharged. The greater the list, the steeper the incline, and the harder the pumps had to work. At around 10 degrees of list, the ballast pumps weren't powerful enough to pump water up the incline from forward tanks to stern discharge points. The system literally couldn't correct the list, because the list itself prevented the corrective mechanism from functioning. By 1:30 a.m., the list had reached 10-12 degrees. The Ocean Ranger was noticeably tilted. In the accommodation modules, furniture slid across floors. In the galley, plates and cups crashed from tables. Men not holding onto something fell as the platform lurched in the waves. Captain Hulse made the critical decision: evacuate. The platform was becoming unstable. The list was worsening, and the ballast control situation wasn't improving. Better to evacuate while they still could, than wait until the platform was listing so severely that launching lifeboats became impossible. At 1:30 a.m., the Ocean Ranger transmitted its final message to shore: there will be no further radio communications from Ocean Ranger. We are going to lifeboat stations. We are abandoning the platform. The message was received by Mobil's shore operations and immediately relayed to Canadian Coast Guard and rescue coordination centers. But the transmission created as many questions as answers. Why were they abandoning? How severe was the situation? Were they in immediate danger of sinking, or just being cautious? Aboard the Ocean Ranger, general alarm sounded, 7 short blasts followed by 1 long blast, the signal to abandon platform. For most crew members, this was the first indication of how serious the situation had become. Many had been in their bunks sleeping, unaware of the list or the ballast control failure. They woke to alarm bells and announcements to report to lifeboat stations. The crew began the evacuation process. Each man grabbed survival gear, immersion suits if available, life jackets, emergency beacons. The Ocean Ranger carried survival equipment, but not enough modern immersion suits for all crew. Many men had only life jackets, and whatever warm clothing they could quickly put on. Immersion suits, full-body waterproof suits designed to prevent hypothermia in cold water, were critical for survival in the North Atlantic in February. Water temperature was approximately 2 degrees Celsius (36 degrees Fahrenheit). Without thermal protection, a person in that water would lose consciousness from hypothermia within 15-30 minutes and die within 30-60 minutes. With an immersion suit, survival time extended to several hours, possibly longer. But the Ocean Ranger had only about 30 immersion suits for 84 crew members. The suits were expensive, and regulations didn't require enough suits for all crew. The assumption was that in an emergency, helicopters would arrive quickly, or crew would be rescued before hypothermia became lethal. This assumption was about to be tested. The crew assembled at lifeboat stations on the port and starboard sides of the platform. The Ocean Ranger had multiple lifeboats, enclosed capsules designed to be launched even in severe weather. The boats could theoretically accommodate all 84 crew members if properly loaded, but launching lifeboats from a listing platform in 100-foot seas and 90-knot winds was extraordinarily difficult. Lifeboats on semi-submersible rigs are launched using gravity drop systems. The boat releases from davits and falls toward the water, with cables controlling descent rate. This system works when the platform is relatively level, but with a 12-degree list and increasing, the geometry was wrong. Boats on the high side starboard were too far from the water. Boats on the low side port risked swinging into the platform structure as they descended. At 1:45 a.m., the crew attempted to launch the first lifeboat on the port side. 20 men crowded into the enclosed capsule, designed for 18 but packed tighter in the emergency. The boat released from its davits and began descending, but the platform was rolling violently in the waves, and the list was worsening. The lifeboat swung on its cables, struck the platform's side with a metallic crash, swung out, then crashed again. Inside, men were thrown against walls and each other, some injured by the impacts. The boat reached the water and released from its cables. For a moment it seemed successful, a lifeboat floating free with 20 men aboard. But the seas were monstrous. The lifeboat disappeared into a trough between waves, then reappeared riding up the face of an 80-foot wave. The small boat was completely at the mercy of the storm. From the Ocean Ranger's deck, The remaining crew watched the lifeboat disappear into the darkness and snow. They couldn't tell if it was making progress away from the platform or being swept around by wind and current. They had no way to communicate with the men in the boat. They could only hope the lifeboat would survive until rescue vessels arrived. At 2 a.m., the list reached 15 degrees. Walking on deck was becoming nearly impossible. Equipment was sliding, crashing, creating additional hazards. The platform was groaning, metal under stress making sounds that no one wanted to hear. Captain Hulse ordered abandonment of the remaining lifeboats. Get everyone off the platform immediately. But launching was becoming impossible. A second lifeboat was prepared, loaded with approximately 15 men, and released. The boat descended but was caught by a wave before it could detach from its cables. The wave slammed the boat against the platform repeatedly, crushing the fiberglass shell. The boat broke apart, spilling men into the freezing water still attached to the platform by tangled cables. Men in the water struggled, some climbing back toward the platform, others trying to swim away from the structure before waves crushed them against steel. Kent Thompson was on deck helping with lifeboat operations when he saw the second boat disintegrate. He immediately understood, the lifeboats weren't going to save them. The conditions were too severe, the platform was too unstable, the boats couldn't survive the launch or the seas. Anyone getting into a lifeboat was gambling with worse odds than staying on the platform. We need to wait for rescue vessels. Kent shouted to Captain Hulse over the wind. Let the standby boats come alongside. We can't launch in these conditions. Hulse knew Kent was right. But would the platform stay afloat long enough for rescue vessels to arrive? The list was increasing, the bow was sinking, and the ballast control system was completely non-functional. The Ocean Ranger could capsize at any moment. Signal the standby vessels. Hulse ordered. Tell them we need immediate evacuation. We're staying on the platform until they arrive. The Seaforth Highlander, a supply vessel designated as standby support for the Ocean Ranger, had been alerted when the Mayday was first transmitted. The vessel was approximately 10 miles away, fighting through the same storm that was destroying the Ocean Ranger. Captain Saunders pushed the Seaforth to maximum speed, knowing that men's lives depended on how quickly he could reach the rig. But the Seaforth was a supply vessel, not designed for heavy weather operation. Waves were breaking over the bow. The vessel was pitching violently, making 30-degree rolls. Equipment on deck was breaking loose despite being secured. Captain Saunders and his crew were risking their own lives to attempt rescue, and they knew it. At 2:20 a.m., the third lifeboat was launched despite the decision to wait for standby vessels. Whether this was crew initiative, miscommunication, or panic, no one would ever know. The boat with approximately 10 men aboard descended and reached the water. This boat survived the launch intact and floated away from the platform. The Seaforth Highlander arrived at the Ocean Ranger's position at 2:35 a.m. What they saw was nightmare. The massive platform listing severely, lights still blazing, men visible on deck waving and signaling, and in the water around the platform men floating, some in groups, some alone, some moving, some still. Captain Saunders maneuvered the Seaforth toward the first group of men in the water, survivors from the lifeboats that had failed during launch. The Seaforth crew threw lines, life rings, anything that might help pull men aboard, but the seas made it nearly impossible. The supply vessel was rolling 30-40 degrees, rising and falling 20-30 feet with each wave. Men in the water would drift close, then be swept away by current or waves. One of the launched lifeboats, the third one with 10 men aboard, approached the Seaforth from astern. The lifeboat was still afloat, still intact, steaming under its own power toward the rescue vessel. Hope surged through the Seaforth's crew. If they could get these men aboard, it would prove rescue was possible. The lifeboat pulled alongside the Seaforth's port side. Crew members threw lines to secure it. The men in the lifeboat grabbed the lines. For a moment, connection was established, but then a wave lifted the small lifeboat and smashed it against the Seaforth's steel hull. The fiberglass boat crumpled like an eggshell. The hull ruptured, water flooded in instantly. The 10 men spilled into the water, some were injured by the impact, all were suddenly swimming, or trying to swim, in 2-degree water with waves towering over them. They grabbed onto the collapsed lifeboat, which remained partially afloat, despite being destroyed. They clung to the wreckage, screaming for help that was 20 feet away but might as well have been miles. The Seaforth's crew attempted everything. They threw grappling hooks to try to pull men close enough to grab. They lowered cargo nets over the side for men to climb. They even considered sending crew members into the water with lines attached, though this would likely just add to the casualties. Nothing worked. The seas were too violent, the temperature too cold, the men too quickly weakening. Bob Whelan, the electrician who'd been planning his April wedding, was in the water clinging to the collapsed lifeboat. He was wearing a life jacket, but not an immersion suit. There hadn't been enough suits, and he hadn't been one of the lucky ones to get one. The Seaforth's crew could see him clearly, could watch him slowly lose his grip, could see the hypothermia taking him. They threw a grappling hook that caught his life jacket. They pulled. The hook ripped through the life jacket material, and Bob slipped underwater, gone. One man was wearing an orange immersion suit, one of the 30 available for 84 crew. The suit was keeping him alive, but he was exhausted from swimming, disoriented by cold and shock. The Seaforth maneuvered close, narrowly avoiding running him over with the propellers. A crew member hooked him with a grappling hook, catching the suit material. They pulled. The man came alongside, but at that moment, a wave lifted the Seaforth and dropped it down, and the man slipped below the waterline, pulled under by the motion. When the Seaforth rose again, he was gone. The Seaforth crew watched helplessly as men in the water succumbed one by one. Hypothermia is insidious. First violent shivering as the body tries to generate heat, then confusion and disorientation as core temperature drops. Then loss of muscle control, unable to grip, unable to swim, unable to help yourself even when rescue is feet away. Then loss of consciousness, then death. The men clinging to the collapsed lifeboat died over the course of 15-20 minutes. The Seaforth's crew, experienced mariners who'd seen rough seas and dangerous situations, stood on deck crying, screaming in frustration, watching men die within throwing distance, and being completely unable to save them. At 2:45 a.m., the first rescue helicopter arrived from Gander, a Canadian Coast Guard Labrador helicopter flown by Captain Mike Clark. The helicopter approached the scene and immediately faced impossible conditions. Winds were gusting to 90 knots, near the helicopter's maximum operating limits. Visibility was near zero in snow and sea spray. The waves made it impossible to maintain stable hover. Master Corporal Randy Brown, the search and rescue technician, volunteered to be lowered into the water to retrieve survivors. Captain Clark positioned the helicopter over a group of men floating in the water and lowered Brown on a 24-meter cable. Brown descended through howling wind and blinding snow toward the black water below. Brown reached the first man he'd been lowered to retrieve. The man was floating face down, not moving. Brown checked for pulse, found none. Dead. Brown signaled to be moved to the next man. Dead. And the next. Dead. Every man Brown reached was already gone. Captain Clark made the agonizing decision to abort the helicopter rescue attempt. The conditions were too dangerous, the helicopter was being battered by wind, and attempting water rescues was suicidal for the rescue crew. Instead, Clark repositioned the helicopter to provide aerial observation, using the helicopter's searchlight to illuminate the water and guide surface vessels to survivors. But as Clark flew over the area, the grim reality became clear. There were no survivors, only bodies. Dozens of them, floating in life jackets, already dead from hypothermia or drowning. The men who'd abandoned the Ocean Ranger, whether in lifeboats or jumping into the water, had all died within 20 minutes of entering the water. At 3:13 a.m., the Ocean Ranger capsized. The platform that had seemed unsinkable, that had weathered 2 years of North Atlantic storms, that represented the pinnacle of offshore engineering, rolled onto its side and sank beneath the waves. The massive structure, 25,000 tons of steel, as tall as a 30-story building, disappeared in approximately 15 seconds once it passed the critical tipping point. Men who'd remained aboard, hoping to be rescued before the platform sank, went down with it. Some were trapped inside as the structure rolled, others jumped as the platform capsized but entered the water too late, in the wrong conditions, without flotation or thermal protection. None survived. The Seaforth Highlander, other standby vessels, and rescue helicopters continued searching through the night and into the next day. They found bodies. They found debris, They found life jackets and survival equipment, and pieces of lifeboats. They found no living souls. By February 16, 48 hours after the disaster, the search transitioned from rescue to recovery. All 84 crew members of the Ocean Ranger were presumed dead. Only 22 bodies were recovered from the water. The remaining 62 were never found, either still trapped in the sunken platform or carried away by currents, lost in the vast Atlantic. The bodies that were recovered were brought to Pier 17 in St. John's Harbor. Media were kept away, no photographs were allowed. The bodies had been in 2-degree water for hours or days. They were identified by dental records, personal effects, tattoos. Some couldn't be identified, and were buried as unknown. Bob Whelan's body was among those recovered. His fiancée Lisa identified him. They'd been planning an April wedding. Instead, she attended his funeral in February. She never married. In interviews decades later, she said she'd never recovered from losing him, from knowing he died so close to rescue, from the senselessness of a disaster that was entirely preventable. Kent Thompson's body was never found. His wife and 2 children received a death certificate marked "Lost at Sea." Without a body, closure was impossible. His children grew up with a father who'd disappeared, whose final moments were unknown, who'd simply ceased to exist on a February night in the North Atlantic. The investigation began immediately. Multiple agencies were involved. The Canadian Royal Commission on the Ocean Ranger Marine Disaster, American Maritime Authorities since ODECO was American-owned, Norwegian investigators, since the platform was similar to Norwegian rigs, and industry safety experts. The investigation lasted 2 years and produced comprehensive findings. The immediate cause, the shattered porthole flooding the ballast control room, was clear. But why was a critical control room with electrical equipment positioned just 25 feet above the waterline and protected by standard glass? The investigation found that ODECO's designers had miscalculated maximum wave heights and hadn't considered rogue waves. The 25-foot elevation was considered safe based on statistical wave models that didn't account for extreme outliers. The ballast control system's vulnerability to flooding was identified as a fundamental design flaw. Critical systems should have redundancy, backup controls, and protection from environmental hazards. The Ocean Ranger's ballast control had none of these. A single flooded room disabled the entire system. The lack of adequate training for manual ballast control was found to be a systemic failure. ODECO had prioritized automated operations and hadn't trained crew for manual intervention. When the automated system failed, the crew couldn't effectively operate the manual controls because they'd never been properly taught. The insufficient number of immersion suits, 30 suits for 84 crew, was identified as a regulatory failure. Canadian regulations didn't require enough suits for all crew, assuming that rescue would occur quickly enough that some crew could survive with life jackets alone. The Ocean Ranger proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. In North Atlantic winter conditions, survival without thermal protection was measured in minutes, not hours. The lifeboat launching system's vulnerability to list was a design flaw shared by many semi-submersible platforms. The gravity drop system worked well when the platform was level but became dangerous or impossible when listing. The investigation recommended alternative launching systems that could function even on severely listing platforms. Most damningly, the investigation found that ODECO and Mobil had prioritized production over safety. The decision to continue operations despite worsening weather, the pressure to avoid shutdowns that would cost money, the corporate culture that discouraged caution, all contributed to creating conditions where disaster was more likely. The Royal Commission concluded, the Ocean Ranger disaster was not an unforeseeable accident but the predictable result of design flaws, inadequate training, insufficient safety equipment, and organizational cultures that prioritized operational continuity over crew safety. Every death was preventable. The recommendations were comprehensive: redesign ballast control rooms to protect critical equipment from flooding, require backup control systems, mandate sufficient immersion suits for all crew, improve lifeboat launching systems, enhance crew training for emergency situations, and strengthen regulatory oversight of offshore operations. Many recommendations were implemented. Canadian offshore regulations were strengthened significantly. The offshore industry, shocked by losing 84 men in a single disaster, improved safety standards, training, and equipment. Modern offshore platforms have redundant control systems, adequate survival equipment, and enhanced emergency procedures. But implementation was uneven and took years. And the reforms came too late for the 84 dead of the Ocean Ranger. ODECO faced no criminal charges. The company was sued by families of the dead in civil courts. Cases were settled for undisclosed amounts, but legal documents suggest average settlements of approximately $300,000 $500,000 per death. Substantial compensation by 1980s standards but inadequate for lives lost. Mobil Oil Canada faced no direct liability since they were chartering rather than owning the platform. The company expressed condolences and established a memorial fund but bore no legal responsibility for the disaster. No individuals were criminally charged. The investigation found systemic failures rather than individual negligence that met criminal standards. The designers who'd placed the control room too low, the trainers who hadn't taught manual ballast control, the managers who'd prioritized production, all had made decisions that contributed to 84 deaths but none faced personal criminal accountability. The Ocean Ranger wreck remained on the seafloor 100 meters deep until salvage operations in 1983. The wreck was considered a navigation hazard and was raised, then re-sunk in deeper water. During salvage operations, 2 divers were killed when cutting into fuel tanks caused an explosion. A third diver was killed when debris fell and crushed him. The Ocean Ranger's death toll ultimately reached 87 men. The disaster's impact on offshore drilling was profound but temporary. Operations in the Grand Banks were suspended for months, public confidence in offshore safety plummeted. Newfoundland communities that had sent men to their deaths on the Ocean Ranger were devastated, families destroyed, widows left without support, children orphaned. But within years drilling resumed. The Hibernia oil field was too valuable to abandon. New platforms were built with enhanced safety features. Crews returned offshore. The industry recovered because economic imperatives overrode fear and grief. This pattern disaster, pause, reform, resumption, is typical of high-risk industries. The Ocean Ranger demonstrated that offshore platforms weren't unsinkable, that even the most sophisticated technology could fail catastrophically, that design flaws could kill everyone aboard. But the industry learned selectively, it improved technical systems while maintaining the same corporate cultures that prioritize production over caution. The memorial to the 84 dead stands in St. John's, Newfoundland, a granite monument listing names in alphabetical order. Every February 15th, a small ceremony is held. Families of the dead attend, though fewer each year as time passes. The youngest child orphaned by the Ocean Ranger is now over 40 years old. The disaster is fading from living memory into history. The lesson of the Ocean Ranger that confidence in technology can kill, that unsinkable is a dangerous word, that design flaws remain dormant until conditions test them to failure, remains relevant but is frequently ignored. Offshore drilling continues in harsh environments worldwide. Platforms operate in storms. Crews trust that technology will protect them. Most of the time it does, until it doesn't. The Ocean Ranger was designed to withstand 100-knot winds and 110-foot waves. The storm that killed 84 men exceeded those limits, but not by much. A 120-foot rogue wave shattered one window, 18 inches in diameter, flooded one room. That one flooded room disabled the ballast control system, which caused the platform to list, which prevented lifeboats from launching successfully, which left 84 men in water cold enough to kill them in 20 minutes while rescue vessels watched helplessly from 50 feet away. Kent Thompson had said at 7 p.m., "She'll ride it out. She always does." 8 hours later he was dead, along with everyone who'd trusted the unsinkable platform. The Ocean Ranger didn't ride it out. The technology didn't save them. The design flaw that no one had considered critical, a porthole 25 feet above the waterline protected by standard glass, killed them all. Crew trusted the unsinkable oil rig, until rogue wave shattered one window, 84 dead, 22 bodies recovered, 62 lost forever in the Atlantic, and a lesson written in frozen corpses and empty lifeboats that confidence in technology is only as reliable as the worst-case scenario no one designed for, and that when that scenario arrives on a February night in the North Atlantic, All the sophistication and engineering in the world won't save men floating in water that kills in minutes while rescue ships throw grappling hooks that catch life jackets but can't hold bodies that slip beneath the waves, dead from cold and the certainty that the unsinkable platform that was supposed to protect them had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable.